economics from Università Bocconi in Italy, and a PhD degree in economics from MIT 1992. He joined the University of Chicago Booth Business School faculty in 1992. He is a faculty research fellow for the National Bureau of Economic Research and the director of the American Finance Association. Luigi Zingales is definitely one of the top corporate governance researchers in the world, who everybody knows and everybody cherishes and cites. You know, he is considered one of the most versatile, creative, and original financial economists, as I'm sure you soon recognize. And in the tradition of the great economists of the University of Chicago, no topic appears to scare him. I'm looking forward to his speech. He will soon talk with us about his new book, A Capitalism for the People. In this book, Zingales offers some ideas on how to rescue the markets and how to rescue the capitalistic system from the problems that have recently derailed it and made it a little bit controversial. I'm earnestly and anxiously anticipating your talk, and please welcome Professor Zingales.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Benny, and thanks for the invitation here. Thanks to the Ackerman Endowment for making this possible. So what I want to describe to you is why I wrote this book. Generally, sort of academics don't spend much time writing more broad audience books. But I felt really worried about the path that the United States are taking and the world economy is taking in the last few years. If you go back roughly 20 years ago, we thought that the ideological debate had ended. Francis Fukuyama announced the end of history after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And of course, it's not the end of the human stories, but in a sense of Hegel, is the end of a tension between thesis and antithesis. In the view of Marx and Marxists, this sort of tension should have concluded with the triumph of socialism. And out of the irony of history, that sort of tension ended up with the triumph of capitalism. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Eastern Bloc, represented the triumph of what I call real capitalism, that became the standard throughout the world. And sure, people were discussing about a German version of it, maybe a sustainable version of it, but were like different flavors of the same ice cream. There was a complete dominance of the capitalist view of the world until basically the crisis came along. And with the crisis, people realized that there were problems, but there wasn't really a solution. From Occupy Wall Street to the indignados in Spain to actually people in Israel, a lot of young people started to complain against the system, but they really did not have an alternative to propose. And so what I tried to do in this book is trying to say, wait a minute, let's try to find an alternative to real capitalism, not necessarily in a third way between capitalism and socialism, but going back to the origin of the idea of capitalism and free market, and trying to see whether what we observe today, the crisis itself, and a lot of things that we don't like, are really essential to the system itself, or not a manifestation of a degeneration of that system into something that now goes under the name of chronic capitalism. And that's the thesis I want to sort of bring to you, and is the fact that a lot of what we don't like and what people protest against is not essential to the capitalist idea, is a outproduct of the degeneration that we observe today. And so the version of capitalism that I endorse and I propose is nothing new. It's just a return to Adam Smith in its essence, but the true Adam Smith, that is the man who introduced in human history the concept of competition as a positive element. I think that we don't fully appreciate how revolutionary that idea was. In the Italian Middle Age, competition was seen as a crime, and the guilds were created to stop and prevent it. And to this day, in most of the world, competition is seen as an evil element we want to stop, reduce, limit. And Adam Smith is the first one to say competition is the major ingredient that transforms individual pursuit of self-interest into the common good. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher, was not somebody who would ever advocate that greed is good, as somebody has sort of claimed. He was not advocating that following your self-interest is something good to do. He was simply saying that the great aspect of the capitalist system is that it's able to transform, through competition, the pursuit of self-interest into the common good. And competition is what makes capitalism work for everyone, is what makes capitalism a sort of a fair and almost moral aspect of society. I always tell, and I'm not very popular in Italy for that, but I always tell in Italy that there is a reason why nepotism was invented in Rome in the Catholic Church. Why? Because the Catholic Church insisted on maintaining a monopoly. And that monopoly was maintained over the centuries with a brute force, and if you were dissenting, you were burned alive, like Giordano Bruno reminds us in Campo dei Fiori. There is a statue there. Giordano Bruno was not sort of an outtake, he was simply trying to find a different form of sort of religiosity, and was burned alive. And it's precisely because of that monopoly that the church could appoint nephews. Nephews is a polite word for sort of children that were not supposed to be children of the Pope, but nephews to important position in the church. Why? Because you can appoint idiots in a monopoly and still retain your monopoly. If you are in a competitive environment, that is not possible. The Protestant church in the United States is not necessarily theologically better, but because it operates in a competitive environment, if you try to appoint an idiot at head of your church, the church will disappear, will lose sort of followers, will lose customers, and will disappear from the face of earth. So competition is what keeps sort of people in the straight and narrow and force a meritocracy within organization. Without competition, you have sort of nepotism, you have corruption. With competition, that's not possible. And the beauty of this is long-term, the competition makes the benefits the church itself. It's not a coincidence that today there are more people going to church in the United States, not also in absolute terms, but also in relative terms, than in Italy. Why? Because long-term, the monopoly is actually destroying the very same organization that's trying to help. I got a lot of inspiration from going to the Grand Canyon in the United States and seeing not only the natural beauty, but sort of a note that was saying, don't feed the wild animals. And underneath there was an explanation. In the United States they explain everything. So there was an explanation saying, if you feed the wild animals, they will lose their ability to gather food in the wilderness. And as a result, this is to the detriment of the animal species themselves. Now, of course, the animals did not put that sign. If they were allowed to choose, they would have chosen otherwise. I think that's a useful metaphor for my view of the capitalist system. Because I would like to see in Washington or in Tel Aviv or in Rome a huge note in front of the parliament and say, please don't help firms. Why? Because that helped to firms coming from the government in the form of subsidies or in the form of monopolies or in the form of restriction to entry, long-term are detrimental to the system itself. Now, of course, capitalists would be delighted to receive these benefits. They lobby very actively for them, but like the animals, the wild animals, they lose their ability to compete. And long term, they don't make the benefits of their firms themselves. Because if you learn how to lobby before you learn how to compete in the marketplace, sooner or later, you're going to die in the global marketplace. So that's to the detriment not only of the taxpayers who have to provide those subsidies, but to the detriment of the firms themselves and the capitalists themselves long term. So the system, the free market system, works very well with its competition. Unfortunately, competition very often is not a standard. And I'm not talking only about the traditional market power that you gain through some comparative advantage, because that generally does not last long term. And I'm not saying that we don't need an antitrust, we do need an antitrust, but I'm not so worried about that form of market power. Those of you who are a bit older like me, remember the time when Microsoft was considered an evil empire. Younger people laugh at it because they think about Microsoft as a very old dinosaur, unable to compete with a new leader like Google, Apple, Facebook, and so on and so forth. Why? Because the monopoly of Microsoft did not last very long, because it was not achieved through the political system. The real dangerous monopoly is the one that firms acquire through the control of the political system. It's precisely when they achieve political power that they distort the marketplace, they change their node, they start to subsidize themselves or put barriers to entry. That is very difficult to undo through competition. And unfortunately, that power of industry has increased tremendously over time. In the 1980s, when sort of there was the Reagan and Thatcher revolution, the idea was get the government off your back. And so a lot of the lobbying that industry was doing was literally to reduce the interference that the government was having in the marketplace. And as such was loved by everybody who loves markets like me. However, over the years, firms have learned their way, and now they don't lobby to get the government off their back, they lobby to get the government in their pockets. And this changed the equation dramatically. So let me give you just an example to give you a sense of how dangerous all this is. We know this because one of the lobbyists in Washington actually was caught doing something illegal. Most lobbying is not illegal, but that he passed the limit. And so he has written a book about sort of the power of lobbying in Washington. And one of the stories in this book is an interesting story of a company you probably have heard of because it was famous also from some fraud they did at the beginning of the millennium, Tyco. This company, among other things, had the brilliant idea to do a reverse merger with a company in the Bermuda to elude corporate taxation in the United States. And at some point, a senator, actually a Republican senator, so it's not a radical guy, decided to propose a law to subject to corporate taxation also those companies that were trying to elude through these tricks. Now, the cost for Tyco would have been $2 billion, which translated means that Tyco was able to avoid $2 billion of taxation through that trick. When Tyco realized this, they say, we need sort of a expert lobbyist to fix the problem. So they hire Jack Abramoff, the guy that eventually went to jail, and they say, we need the A-team level for this sort of mission. And sure enough, Abramoff deployed the A-team level for the modest price of $150,000 a month, and the sort of A-team was playing two strategies, the bad cop and the good cop. So the good cop was giving donations to the fundraising campaigns of the very senators that were trying to pass the law to subject Tyco to taxation. And you know, if you give enough money, eventually you're mollified. The second is the backup strategy, is to create fake grassroots organizations. There's even a name in the United States for that. It's called astroturfing, because you create some fake sort of grassroots, and what they do is sort of, they pay people to go and protest and saying that capitalism as we know will end tomorrow if Tyco was subject to taxation, because this is terrible. And sure enough, with sort of $2 million of total cost, this was eliminated, or this danger was eliminated for Tyco. So if you do a calculation, you get $2 billion saving for $2 million of cost. There is no human activity I know, legal or illegal, that gives you this kind of return. Okay? I'm not an expert on drug dealing, but I doubt that drug dealing gives you this kind of return. So forget sort of R&D, forget anything else. This becomes the primary objective of sort of business throughout the United States and in the world. And I got really concerned when, in March 2009, I had some young fellows who approached me, because I teach entrepreneurship, and they approached me because they had an interesting startup idea. And they wanted to start kind of an alternative to banks. And I was intrigued by the idea, so I started talking to them a bit. And then it occurred to me, why did they come to me? They were not my students. I'm not the only professor of entrepreneurship in Chicago, let alone in the United States. I'm not even the most famous one. So why did they come to me? So I asked, and they revealed that they heard me I was active in the public square. So what they really wanted was an advocate to lobby to receive some of the top money for their startup. And I got disappointed twice. First of all, probably I wasn't clear enough in my statements. I'm not available for these kind of services. But most important, I said, gee, if young entrepreneurs have a lobbying plan before they have a business plan, where do we go? Where do we go from here? And that's exactly what I try to address in the book. So the first half of the book is an exposition of how this problem has emerged in the United States and has reached a level that risks to be of no return. And I'm particularly sensitive of this because I come from a country where this is pervasive and where this problem of chronic capitalism has really destroyed a nation. And you see the results today. And I don't want the United States to go down the same path. And I think there is hope to stop them before it's too late. But it's very dangerous because you have a self-supporting sort of a vicious circle that goes as follows. And I will explain you with sort of a very simple example that actually is taken again from the United States around 2009. So you remember that in early 2009 in the United States there was a huge uproar against the bailouts and especially against the executives that walk away with millions of dollars when the companies were losing billions of dollars. And as a result of this uproar, what you had was that Congress, actually the House, voted a 90% tax on bank bonuses. So 90% tax is tantamount to expropriation. It's even worse than what the French are trying to do, okay? Which is hard to imagine, but it is. And sort of this law never became, this proposal never became law because the Senate knew better than passing that law. However, that was an indication of how even in a country with a long tradition of protection of property rights, populist outrage can lead to crazy actions like this one. Now, unfortunately, the immediate consequence of this crazy action was that Geithner and the Obama administration proposed at the very same time a program called Public-Private Investment Partnership, where the government was heavily subsidizing a few firms to invest in toxic assets. And the rationale for this subsidy, that according to my calculation was to the order of $2 for every dollar they were investing, so it was a massive subsidy. The rationale for this subsidy was, wait a minute, you see, we invest our money, but we are afraid that if we lose our money. If we gain, that money is going to be expropriated by some sort of Congress and pushed by this populist agenda, blah, 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 blah. So we need some protection, and the protection is in the form of a big subsidy. And what they don't realize, and so the logic is a very logical response, but what they don't realize is that that logical response creates even more populist outrage that leads to more demand for protection, and pretty quickly the legitimate entrepreneurs, the ones that want to go about doing their business without lobbying Washington or Rome or Tel Aviv, they disappear from the face of earth, and the only ones who survive are the ones who are corrupt, connected with the political power, and so on and so forth. And the more this is the case, the more people demand sort of populistic responses, because the outrage of the system. Part of the reason why the capitalist system, especially in the United States, survived so long and so well is because there was a sense of fairness in the system, that these sort of subsidies, these bailouts are completely undermined. And so the less public support there is for the free market system, the more there is demand for redistribution, the more there is fear of entrepreneurs, the more there is demand for subsidy, and so on and so forth. It's a very vicious circle that leads pretty quickly to where Italy is today, and it's not a pretty picture. So, how do we fix that? And this is where I kind of leave my academic hat, and I take a few bets. Okay? Because so far, I've described a situation that is very well documented, mostly by others, but I put together sort of this evidence, and I think that the picture is not controversial. What is more controversial is what I do next to try to change it. So I look back in history and I say, look, this is not the first time that we observe a phenomenon of a globalization with a disappearing middle class, with a increasing inequality, and with a sense of injustice and unfairness. At the end of the 19th century in the United States, all these phenomena were there. And the response in the United States, unlike in Europe, was not a Marxist movement, but was a little-known phenomenon called People's Party. And the objective of the People's Party was not to undermine the capitalist system, was more to readdress the imbalance of political power between the ordinary American and the large organized groups, be they corporation or whatever they are. And while this party never won any election, however, spread ideas that eventually trickled down into the agenda, listen to, of a Republican president, Theodore Roosevelt, that implemented them during the period, the Progressive Era legislation, that changed for the better capitalists in America. The idea of antitrust was born during that period. The idea of transparency and disclosure was born during that period. The idea of regulation protecting the consumers was born during that period. The attack to the money trust that was controlling the United States was born during that period. And so, how can we, in a sense, do the same trick and use this populist outrage to improve the system rather than destroy the system? And I think that, paradoxically, there is a common thread between movements that are far apart from the ideological spectrum. You know, the Tea Party movement on the right and the Occupy Wall Street on the left. They both complain bitterly against two different aspects of the same problem. The Tea Party movement is fighting against the overly intrusive government, the Occupy Wall Street is fighting against the overly powerful and intrusive big business. In fact, they are fighting against two sides of the same monster, which is the interlocking, the intermingling of government and big business. Was Fannie Mae, the giant of mortgages in the United States that is costing the taxpayers now more than $200 billion, was Fannie Mae evil because was a private corporation, because it was government sponsored, or because it was a combination of the two so powerful that every member of Congress was basically bought off, and academia was bought off as well? Joe Stiglitz, that goes around complaining against inequality, he was testifying in Congress paid by Fannie Mae that there is less than 1.5 million chances that Fannie Mae would go bust. And so I think we'll be pretty unlucky if we hit that 1.5 million. Okay? And as sort of Morgan Gretchenson writes in one of the books, when one opponent tried to find an academic who would testify against Fannie Mae, he couldn't find any, because said, if I were to testify against Fannie Mae, how would I get my sort of salary in the future? Because Fannie Mae does not only guarantee me the provision or the salary today, they provide me a steady flow of income for the next 20 years. And no sort of a challenger will have that power to do so. So this has been completely destroyed, not only the free competition, also the free intellectual debate. So how can we do that? How can we change this? So first of all, I think we need to make a very clear and sharp difference between being pro-market and being pro-business. Unfortunately, there is not this clear distinction. And both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in the United States compete for who is sort of nicer with business. And they want to appear as pro-business. But you know, businessmen want free market only when they enter a new industry. The moment they are in, they want to increase the bias to entry in order to increase profits. And this is natural and healthy as long as they don't get any help from the government. The moment that the government helps them, then this destroys the level playing field and creates problems for years to come. So it's very important that at least as academics, but also in the political debate, we make this sharp distinction. And unfortunately, you go to the Republicans, and the Republicans are mostly sort of a pro-business party with a pro-market sort of flag. And they dilute people by appearing as defending the market, but what they defend businessmen. And for me, this is easier to see because I've seen in Italy what you get when you have a businessman taking the flag of the free markets. Berlusconi ran many years with a flag of free markets, but what he was running is the flag of defending his own business. And the country was shaped by his own interests and has not grown for the last 20 years. But make no mistake, the other countries are not much better. It's less evident, it's less transparent. The only benefit, the only merit of Berlusconi is to have made a comedy of the tragedy that we all live through. And by making it so humorous, people see it more clearly. Because, you know, Berlusconi is the vertically integrated version of the US Congress. He owns members of parliament who are his own employees. The ministers are all his own employees and make his own interests. In the US Congress, members of parliament are simply future employees of a few small companies. And sort of Secretary of Treasury are just future employees of the same companies. It's less transparent, but it's not less dangerous. And so I think that making this distinction clear, this is a distinction that cuts across right and left. Because when I testify in Congress, I had Joe Stiglitz on my side, and on this merit, we were exactly on the same position. There was no distinction between me and Joe Stiglitz on this point. And I think it's very important that people understand that, because a lot of the partisan division that we observe in Washington, in my view, is just a sideshow. They fight very aggressively on things that I wouldn't say don't matter, but don't matter economically, in which there is not a lot of money at stake, like gay marriage, abortion, and stuff like that. Why? Because when it comes to sort of helping businesses, they're all together. There's no difference between Democrats and Republicans. They're both off in the same way by the same sort of businesses. So what we need to do is sort of drive a distinction and use, this is what I'm a bit provocative, use this populist outrage, directing it in the right direction. Why? Because given the conditions we are living today, sort of a economic crisis, shrinking middle class, a sense of sort of detachment between the elite and the ordinary people, and the sense that the elite have betrayed the rest, given those conditions, populism is inevitable throughout the world. And in most of the world, populism has always been a four-letter word. And rightly so, because populism has been the populism of sort of Peron, of the fascists, or sort of Chavez. However, in the United States, the People's Party was a populist party, but not necessarily a crazy extremist party. And now, to be fair, in the United States, they had their fair share of crazy populists as well. So I don't think that they are exempt from that. However, there is a sense in which you can sort of bring the democratic aspect as a balance, as a counterbalance to the power of business. But how do you elicit this participation? Because if you take literally the economic view of voting, you know, voting is stupid. It's irrational. Why? Because none of us, even during the very contested election in 2000, none of us is really pivotal, is really making a difference in changing the result of the election. So even if you think that you can sort of, you attribute a lot of value to changing the outcome, that big value multiplied by something that is close to zero is zero. And the cost of getting up in the morning and walking to the electoral booth is big enough to discourage you from voting. So the traditional economic view of voting, saying that nobody gets informed, nobody votes, and as a result, we are convicted to be, we're damned to be completely captured by vested interests. I have a bit of a more optimistic view. I think that most people are willing to do a little bit of an effort for the public good. Very few are saints or heroes. Those are in short supply. But everybody, or most people, are willing to make a small effort. So the secret about a functioning democracy is to leverage the small effort of many in a system that works for the system overall. So how do you do that? How do you change the system in that direction? And I give you an example where the United States have succeeded that fairly well. Now, people speak about the excesses of the class action suit. And certainly there are excesses. However, the class action suit is a marvelous example of how you can redefine property rights in a way that we balance the power between the many and the few. Because in a typical country without a class action suit, a claim worth $1 million is much more powerful than a million claims worth $1 each. From an economic point of view, the two should be worth the same, right? Because if you fix them, if you restore them, then you create the same amount of economic value. However, if you have a claim worth $1 million, you have a lot of good lawyers sort of ready to defend you. If you have 1 million claims worth $1, the 1 million people will never find anybody willing to defend them. because the cost of coordination is too big. The class action suit makes it easy to bundle these claims so that the $1 million claim is as valuable as the $1 billion claim. That's a way in which you rebalance the equation just by changing the property rights in the proper way. And this not only rebalances the equation in the legal fight, also in the intellectual fight, because I've seen in Italy, for example, all the corporate lawyers are structurally defendant of the interests of large corporations. Why? Because as a corporate lawyer, the only way to make money is to be advisor to a large corporation. And so as a result, your mind is distorted in that direction, and you're going to become an apologist of what large businessmen want. In the United States, it's not that US lawyers are intrinsically better than Italian lawyers. They are as greedy as the Italian one. The difference is that there is money to be made in defending the small guys, and there is money to be made because of class action. So the class action not only defends the little guys, the class action also creates a better jurisprudence because there is a balance of an intellectual fight. Competition is what saves us in every dimension, and the objective is to try to find those design of institution that creates that. So the class action suit is the best example of how you can use competition and pursuit of self-interest to deliver the public good. So how do you do in other fields? Especially the field that is most important is the one of regulation. Because in order to rebalance the success of power of large corporation and large organization, because unions are not any better, is through some form of regulation. However, all the years spent in Chicago makes me extremely sort of skeptical, because we know that regulation tend to be captured for the reason we just described. And many of my colleagues go to the extreme of saying, since all regulation is captured, the only solution is no regulation at all. I disagree with that, because I don't think that competition, fair competition, is like a jungle. The law of the jungle is the survival of the meanest, is not necessarily the survival of the most efficient. So we do need rules to discipline the marketplace. The question is, how do we design rules that are not designed just to keep the incumbents entrenched, but are designed to favor competition? And so, again, the only way we have is to leverage the democratic system. How do you do that? I think with two simple mechanisms. Number one, we want rules that are simple. So simple that even congressmen can understand that. And it's not a joke, because when Nancy Pelosi passed the Obamacare reform, she said we need to pass it to find what is in it. Which is pretty scary, because the average congressman in the United States does 400 fundraisers a year, more than one a day. So if you do 400 fundraisers a year, you don't have time to read what you approve. And you rely on, for what approval, on what your lobbyists say. And the lobbyists want the law as complicated as possible, because in the complication, there is the room for arbitrariness. You know, in the old days in Italy, law were written in Latin, at a time when nobody understood Latin. Why? Because lawyers could do whatever they wanted with that. Because the only one able to understand Latin were the lawyers, so they were shaping the law in the interest of who was paying the lawyers, who are the powerful. And so a big achievement in democracy was to translate laws into common language and make them relatively simple. Today, regulation is worse than Latin, because if you go to sort of tacit Latin, it's very linear, and the way in which regulation is written is not linear at all. So simplifying that is an essential element. And I say simplifying at the cost of being economically inefficient. Now, for the economist, it's not a small step to make. But I say sometimes I'm willing to take some economically inefficient law, as long as it's simple, in exchange for something that is much more economically efficient, but is so complicated that leads itself to natural distortion. And a beautiful example of this is the issue about separation between investment banking and commercial banking. Glass-Steagall was not an efficient law, but was very simple. Glass-Steagall was written in 24 pages. The Volcker Rule requires 900 pages. And the Volcker Rule is a typical example of how a good intention is distorted in favor of the industry. Because Obama knew that Glass-Steagall was extremely popular, people wanted to separate investment banking for commercial banking, and Volcker has a pretty sort of a basic idea: you don't gamble with federally deposit insured money. That's something that even a third grader can understand. It's difficult to argue with that. However, the rule that goes under the name of Volcker Rule is not something that prohibits banks to speculate with deposit money. They allow banks to do, they forbid banks from doing proprietary trading, but allow them to do trading for a client. Now, what it is trading for a client? So suppose I buy an IBM share with the intention of selling it to a client in a few days. That's not proprietary trading. So the difference between proprietary trading and not proprietary trading is based on intention. Okay? Lawyers know how difficult it is to determine intention in court. It requires sort of complicated trials that last for months. So imagine if for every trade you have to determine intention. It's basically impossible. The Volcker Rule is unenforceable. And I am so cynical as saying the Volcker Rule has been chosen precisely because it's unenforceable. Because Obama wanted to please, so that the populist side is saying we need the separation, and wanted to please also the banks who did not want that separation. So what is best than having a rule that we say, we approve the Volcker Rule, so I'm a good guy, plus I use a fantastic name, like the one of Volcker, and at the same time, I please my bankers' friends by making a rule that doesn't have any bite. That's exactly what is done. So that's the reason why rules that are simple are tighter and easier to debate. And there is no simple rule than a tax. Much regulation can be transformed into ad hoc taxes. And these ad hoc taxes are simple for people to understand, and by the way, the side benefits will also raise some revenues. So, for example, Mayor Bloomberg is trying to introduce a regulation to limit the sale of soda pops in schools in New York. And the argument is that soda pops contain a lot of corn syrup. Corn syrup makes you fat, especially in small kids. This leads to obesity and early diabetes. So that is very costly for society, especially now that we have universal healthcare. So we want to, in some way, reduce the consumption of soda pops by kids. Now, if there is one thing we know as economists, and we don't know a lot of things, but if there is one thing we know, if you tax something, people consume it less. And you can be a right-wing economist, a left-wing economist, a no-hand economist, you agree on that point. So if the goal is to reduce consumption of soda pops, there is a very simple way to do it, which is tax them. Okay? And by the way, on the side, you raise some revenues that these days are not a bad side effect. So why people don't do it? Well, because I'm sure now, and I'm not following the details, but Mayor Bloomberg will probably meet with the major sort of industry expert to establish a regulation. And the only thing I know for sure is that the outcome of that regulation will be that new entrants will be disadvantaged. Because whenever people of the industry sit around a table, the first thing they do is conspire to restrict trade. This is Adam Smith. Nothing new, but still quite important to remember to this day. So if we transform a lot of this, a lot of regulation into taxes, we make it more transparent and people can, through their representative, vote. Most people understand what a tax on soda pops is, and they determine whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And through their representative, they can vote on this. You don't need a PhD in economics to determine whether this is a good thing or not, and you can express that and vote on it. But the other thing that I think is very important is to have data that makes regulation accountable. I think that a lot of good regulation or well-intentioned regulation ends up being detrimental. Why? Because it doesn't fulfill the initial premises. And there is a very simple way to see whether it works or not, to have easily accessible data. Data, however, is, Francis Bacon was saying that knowledge is power. I say that data is power. Data is power because it exposes the problems, and often regulators don't want this data to be shared. A colleague of mine got access to some data from the Fed looking at how good the rating of the Federal Reserve and of state regulators are of different banks. He got hold of that because he worked with a guy at the Fed in order to have access to this data. When he found some results that the Fed did not like, he got his access stopped. That's exactly what most organizations do. They allow you to use the data if the data cooperate in that direction. If they don't cooperate, you don't have access to the data. Surprise, surprise, all the economists find results that please the organization that sponsor the research. It's a strange coincidence, but that's the case. So what I say is extremely important that these data are made available to the public, even with a delay. I don't care, because you may argue that releasing sensitive data about the financial health of banks might be destabilizing in the short term. And we can argue about this, but I can concede that that's the case. However, there is no reason whatsoever why you cannot release the data of 3, 4, 5 years ago. Okay? So with the data of 4 or 5 years ago, I can check who did what and make people accountable. Make regulators accountable of what they've done. In anticipation of making regulation accountable, then people behave in a different way. So I think access to data, free access to data is important. Why? It's particularly important when you have two elements, competitive academic market and competitive media market. Because the average voter will not analyze the data. Who is going to analyze the data are either the academics or the journalists. You want competition in those markets to push people to produce the most interesting result, because it's much more interesting to have a scoop about a sort of a regulator doing something wrong or large businesses abusing its power than doing something sort of that nothing is wrong. So there is a interest, profit interest of academics, not profit directly, but sort of into their career, and of journalists to do so as long as the market is competitive. So in Italy, a very famous businessman, Giovanni Agnelli, was proud that he never made one dime, actually 1 lira, with his newspaper. And I think this is something you should not be proud of, something you should be embarrassed of. Because if you're an entrepreneur and you keep a newspaper and you don't make money on that newspaper, the only reason why you're having it is to influence the political power. And so that is not a legitimate reason to have a newspaper. I think that I believe in profit motives because Adam Smith said in competition, profit motive will lead to the good outcome. And that's true in newspaper as well. It's true in the academic market as well. And let me conclude, because Ben is very eager to make me conclude. So let me conclude. I think that there is also another aspect which is important in this battle that we have as teachers of economics and business forgotten, which is the moral dimension. And when I say moral, I don't say moral with a capital M, but I say the importance of social norms in behavior. As economists, we tend to be a bit too cavalier on the issue. So let me make very quickly an example that goes back to a colleague of mine, and I'm not trying to sort of criticize him because his contribution is fantastic. But when sort of Gary Becker introduced the theory of crime, the economic theory of crime, he sort of stated that people commit a crime if the expected benefits is bigger than the expected cost, when the expected cost is the probability, the product between the probability of being caught and the penalty you receive if you're caught. Now, this is a perfectly reasonable theory. However, many people teach this as it is rational to commit a crime when the expected benefits is bigger than the expected cost. Now, when you say it's rational to commit a crime, implicitly you are saying it's irrational not to commit a crime when the expected benefits is bigger than the expected cost. And irrational is not exactly a value-free statement. So we economists pretend to be just positive scientists that don't take any moral stand. You know, Sartre was saying that human beings cannot not choose. They are convicted to choose, because not choosing is choosing not to choose. And the same is true about morality. Not taking a moral stand is basically choosing to take a very subtle and not open moral stand. And so I think that as economists, and as a teacher of economics, we should take a stand on what we think are good way to do business and bad way to do business. So coming back to lobbying and distorting competition, we should be very open to say that's a way we don't consider a good way to do business. Because even Milton Friedman, when he said that the only responsibility, the only social responsibility of business is to make profits, he said with fair competition and following the rules. So he was very clear that making money at all costs, sort of distorting competition, buying the government consensus, etc., was not a legitimate way to make money, and we have forgotten along the way. And we are partly responsible of the set of businessmen that see money as the only objective and translate Adam Smith as saying greed is good. Poor guy is going to reward him in his grave for hearing that, and so on and so forth. And I think it's important that we are, as business teachers, on the front line of this fight, because we really have a vested interest in defending this meritocratic, competitive form of capitalism. Because, you know, people in Italy don't go to business school. They go to political school. That's where they get their advantage in life. The only reason why people come to business school is because they think that the system is meritocratic and accumulating human capital is good. So if we go in a direction in which a relationship in Rome or Washington is more important than what you know, we are finished, we're out of business. So it is our not only moral duty, but also our interest to defend the free, ideal version of capitalism against the crony form of capitalism that is prevailing throughout the world. Thank you.